I want to read for you a passage of Scripture. It's Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 38. You'll see it on the screen. You've heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So we're in this series, Reclamation, and it leads us into this pivotal passage of Scripture that when it comes to Christian ethics, is a pretty big deal, but it's also one of the most challenged and most misunderstood passages of Scripture and words from the mouth of Jesus. For instance, you look at things like turn the other cheek, don't resist evil, all those different things. Put yourself in the shoes of an enslaved African in the 1830s. How does that work out for you? Not resisting evil. Or fast forward, you're a Jew in Germany in the 1930s. How does that look for you? Or go to the 1980s, you're a farm worker in Guatemala during the outbreak of the Civil War, and where you're minimized and marginalized. How does that work for you? Don't resist an evil person? Really? I don't even know if that's ethical. We're supposed to resist evil, right? That's what we're called to. So this is the countercultural message that Jesus is reclaiming, and then he's inviting us to participate in that. It looks this way. It's a way of viewing life and living life that doesn't fit with the dominant experiences of this world. That's what he's calling us to. If we profess a faith in Jesus, we're following Jesus. It's a way of viewing life and living life that doesn't fit with the dominant experiences of this world. Like this whole turn the other cheek business, right? I mean, come on. Seriously? I mean, some of you, even in this room, have suffered at the hands of bigotry. I know that. People have been racist towards you. Some of you in this room have been marginalized. You've suffered at the hands of other people. You've been mistreated at the hands of other people. And Jesus says, do good to those that harm you. Well, give to the person who steals from you. Okay, my brain's about to pop. Okay, this doesn't make any sense. Work twice as hard for somebody who doesn't deserve it? This doesn't work out in our economy. That's not how our world works. It does not make sense, does it? Can the church people be honest for a second? I mean, can we? I mean, I bet, and I didn't grow up in the church, but I bet there's a whole slew of people in this room right now watching online that could raise their hand, don't do it, but could raise your hand if I asked you, did you know about this verse before you turned 18? Even as a child, did you hear the verse, turn the other cheek, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, all those kinds of different things? And you'd be able to say yes. You've memorized this verse for a long, long time. Okay, but isn't there a tiny little part of you that's always been like, I mean, I know Jesus said it, but I don't know if I'm going to do it. I get that Jesus said that, but I mean, what? It's just not right. It's not right. It doesn't make any sense. We live in a world where even Christians toss this one out on the regular, okay, on the daily. We tend to just toss it out the window. That doesn't change the fact, though, that Jesus said it. He said these words, which is crazy. Still, the world we live in has injustice, doesn't it? The world we live in is a hard place. People lie in this world. People hurt other people in this world. Use people, abuse people. And a lot of times that happens in the name of God. There's hate and bigotry in this world, sometimes in the name of God. There's wars and genocide in this world, sometimes even in the name of God. Our world can be a scary place. It's a place to sometimes fear because of the things that are going on. It's a dangerous world. And when you step into the world that we see, the world that we live in, our natural default sometimes is to be really, really worried, because if you step into that world, you're vulnerable. You might get exposed. You might get hurt. It's an unsafe world. So you can memorize this passage of Scripture from Jesus. You can nod your head in approval. Sounds pretty good. Turn the other cheek. But what happens when real life smacks you in the face? Like, what happens when somebody literally smacks you in the face? What are you supposed to do? The problem with turn the other cheek is it does not fit how you and I see the world. So follow me here. When it comes to what Jesus is saying here in these verses, we ultimately have a choice. And I wish I could decorate this for you and make it different than what it is, but here's the choice. We either hear what Jesus is saying and we dismiss it. That's all right. You can do that. You can hear what Jesus says and you can dismiss it. Or we have to change the way we see the world and people around us. We have to change. Okay. So to understand this, what I want us to do is just quickly walk through these scenarios that Jesus is laying out in this passage of Scripture. And I kind of summarized them this way. You'll see it on the screen. First of all, it all comes down to don't retaliate. Don't retaliate. Instead, offer costly grace, give provocative generosity, and extend friendship. How you like that? Sound good? Everybody say, "Guh." Try it again. Everybody say, "Guh." Everybody say, "Rose." Gross. Okay? This doesn't sound good at all. It sounds gross. Okay. Now here's the deal. Walk with me. Jesus is quoting from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. You've heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So what is that? What is eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? Other than a catchy saying, it's actually called the law of retribution. So by saying, listen, here's the law. It's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What it is it's equality. Okay, it's a way of communicating a sense of proportion. So if you do me wrong, I can only pay you back at the same equal amount of wrongness. Okay, so eye, okay, an eye. Tooth, okay, a tooth. Now, the reason that God passed that down and made these people understand this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth business is that their vengeance and retribution was out of hand. Okay? So, for example, you insult me, I hit you. Okay? I hit you, you stab me. You stab me, I come after your family. Like, okay? I mean, it makes for really good movies, right? Okay. And we love it in those movies, right? When the victim gets vengeance, right? I mean, it's just like, yes, I have a secret set of skills. And I'll find you, and I will kill you, right? I mean, it's that, we love that like darkness. It stokes something in us. So an eye for an eye, listen closely, and a tooth for a tooth, that mentality and that law was meant to de-escalate things. So it didn't get out of hand. So it wasn't, okay, you hit me, I stabbed you. It was hit, cheat, steal. So it was even, right? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which in theory sounds pretty good. Sounds pretty good. It was meant for de-escalation, to keep order and peace, offering rules of restraint. Okay. But then Jesus shows up, and he does that Jesus thing. So he says, you've heard that it was said, like eye for an eye, which seems kind of fair. He's like, don't do that. In fact, don't do anything. Don't retaliate at all. At all. Not a good movie plot, by the way, okay? What's his point? You value peace more than getting even. Now, I don't feel good about that. It's extremely unsatisfying. How does that create peace? Think about this. How does that create peace? By allowing an evil person off the hook? How does that create peace? You can't just stand back and do nothing, right? Do nothing? Is that even ethical? Actually, Jesus does not say do nothing. He doesn't say do nothing. Instead, he gives us some examples of what we do instead. He doesn't say do nothing. He says, here's what you need to do. So he can open the door for peace. Now, I need to warn you, it's still messed up. It's really upside down. Doesn't make any logical sense. First up, if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Turn to them the other cheek also. Stephen Slavo, would you join me up here? I need a volunteer. That's not really volunteering, but everybody give Steve a hand. Okay. All right, you stand right there. Just face me. Okay, so in the Roman world back then in Jesus' day, if I was, and I'm right-handed, most people are right-handed. Left-handed people don't act like I'm marginalizing you right now. You're fine. You're more musical or whatever, artistic. Okay, so the majority of the world is right-handed. So if I'm going to strike you, as Jesus says, on the right cheek with my right hand, I'm not doing that business. What am I doing? I'm going, shh. Okay, yeah, it sounds like that too. Shh. I'm not going to slap you, man. Okay, you look a little scared. I know I'm a big dude. So I'm going to smack you, right, like that. So that's very dismissive, isn't it? It's like somebody coming up to you and just, it's meant to minimize, right? A backhanded slap is meant to say, I'm here, you're there. And you're discarded in a way. You're dismissing that person. So Jesus, now watch the mechanics of this. I've just smacked you on your right cheek. And now look at my posture. And Jesus says, turn to them the other cheek as well. What am I forced to do at that point? If I'm going to strike him on his left cheek with my right hand, open-handed, face-to-face, man-to-man. This looks different than this. And what happens is Jesus is saying, look, what you just reclaimed by turning the other cheek is actually my necessity to treat you as an equal. I don't get to diminish you anymore. You're saying, no, if you're going to smack me right. Boom. Okay, Steve, go sit down. Give Steve a hand. So Jesus' response here is don't retaliate. Actually, he says, stand your ground. Are you following that? Turn the other cheek too. Turn the other cheek. How many of you are ready to sign up for that? Sound like fun? Okay. But again, remember the mechanics of this. If somebody uses their backhand at you, it's to dismiss you. But then if you turn to them the other cheek, you're forcing them then to be face-to-face and strike you as a normal situation. Now, it sounds like I'm playing semantics here, but hang with me. They're forced to treat you not as something less than, but as a fellow human being. So Jesus is saying in this, offer some costly grace. This is going to cost you. It's going to hurt. But offer grace. Offer grace. Now, don't worry. This gets worse. How many of you ever had a dream that you went to school and only had your underwear on? Yes? Or work? I had that dream once, and then it was true. I'm just kidding. It wasn't last night. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Okay, so what does this have to do with anything? So you were normally sued back in Jesus' day if you had a debt that you weren't repaying. Okay, now it was a Ponzi scheme. It was a total stacked deck, and the people who suffered most in that were poor people. The goal was to keep poor people poor. One of the ways to do that was to get them indebted enough that they couldn't pay back their debts, and then you could manipulate them. Okay? Keep the poor people poor and keep them in debt so that you can take advantage of them. And that's what was going on even among the religious leaders in Jesus' day. They were keeping these poor people indebted. But there was one gracious caveat. You were not allowed to sue a poor person for their coat. If you see the images, the flannel graphs or whatever, the traditional garb for guys was an overcoat a long shirt that would go down, sandals, okay? And so you weren't allowed to sue them for their coat because their coat was actually a tool. It was a blanket at night. It kept them warm. It kept them covered. It kept them protected. All those kinds of different things. It seemed cruel if you were going to sue somebody for their coat because it would take away a necessity for them. So to get around that, they were smart. They'd be like, okay, I'll sue you for your shirt instead. I'll sue you for your shirt. And what Jesus says is this. He says, if somebody sues you for your shirt, take off your coat and give them your coat too. What does that mean? It means now I'm standing here naked. I'm vulnerable, right? I'm exposed. What is Jesus doing here? He's being very provocative, actually. It's provocative generosity. In other words, I want you to act in such a way that if somebody comes after this part of your clothing, give to them everything. Give them everything. That way, it's exposed. It's exposed. Provocatively generous. Give them your shirt and your coat. He's being intentionally provocative. Expose the injustice by not repaying evil, but by being generous. Sound fun? Okay, so that's matched in strangeness by the third one. If anybody forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. So in Jesus' day, again, a Roman soldier could come up to a Jewish citizen and demand that the Jewish citizen carry their pack for only 1 mile, up to 1 mile. Okay? After the mile, the Roman soldier couldn't demand that of the Jewish citizen anymore. And so Jesus is saying that in that culture, if I was a Roman soldier, I could come up to you and say, hey, drop it, carry my pack, pick up my pack, we're going to go 1 mile. They would be forced to carry my pack for 1 mile. Jesus says, when you get to the end of that, and he looks at you and you look at him, just kind of, hey man, I got time. Like, let's keep going. Where do you need to go? Yuck. Gross. I don't want to do that. You just made me do something, and now I'm offering to do something. Listen, maybe the first mile he treats you, like something to be discarded, like an animal, as something less than. You've just been treated as a pack animal, but by going that 2nd mile, what are you doing? You're asserting your humanity. Actually, this is my choice to do this. You're not making me do this. This is my choice. You're asserting your humanity. You aren't acting like a tool anymore. You're treating him as a friend. As a friend. At which point, it feels really justifiable to, I know that Jesus said these things, but I forgot, or whatever. It feels easy to dismiss these things. Just a couple weeks ago, Pastor Rich, you said that we need to demand our dignity. If somebody abuses us, if somebody treats us poorly, if somebody diminishes us and views us as somehow less than created in the image of God and treats us horribly, you need to demand your dignity. This doesn't sound like demanding your dignity, does it? Doesn't sound like it at all. But listen closely. Don't retaliate. Offer costly grace, give provocative generosity, offer friendship. It sounds absolutely crazy, but listen. It subverts the power structures of this world. It completely removes the foundation of everything that this world is built on. And maybe even turns enemies into friends. But we would never know unless we don't retaliate. We're going to look at that next week, but right now, when I look at this, I'm going to be honest with you, it does not feel good. I was raised to put up a fight. Somebody hits you, my mom said, make sure you hit them hard enough that they can't hit you again. My mom taught me how to end fights. My mom sounds like a peach. I wish everybody could have met her. But truthfully, this all really feels It feels like Jesus is taking something like the whole eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing, which is hard because you want to escalate it, right? He's taking the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing, and then he's making it even harder. These are irrational rules. You get smacked on the cheek, you're just supposed to turn and take it again? Again, it just seems like Jesus is taking things that are already difficult, a hard situation. He's saying, well, if you're a part of my kingdom and if you're a citizen of my kingdom, if you're going to do what I would do in these situations, you need to make it harder. It's got to be even more difficult. This feels like abuse, right? So are you saying, Rich, that you should allow yourselves to be abused and let other people be abused? No. And Jesus is not saying that either. So remember from the beginning, this actually has to do with how you and I see the world that we live in. The countercultural message Jesus is reclaiming and he's inviting us into is a way of viewing life and living life that does not fit with the dominant experiences of this world. It is easy to think that Jesus is just making this harder. It's not enough to keep an eye for an eye law. Now you have to keep these other laws, but we've already talked about this in this series. Following the letter of the law doesn't change a heart. Living the spirit of the law reflects a changed heart. So let me put it this way. So I need you to listen really closely because I don't want you to hear something I'm not saying. Jesus is not saying that you have to walk the second mile. Jesus is not telling you that you have to turn the other cheek. Jesus is not telling you that you have to give up your belongings. The Sermon on the Mount is describing somebody who doesn't have to do any of those things. You get to do those things. You get to do them because Jesus did the same for us. Sin is a horrible affront to God. It's a slap in the face of his love. And yet Jesus allowed us to slap him. And even then our sin demanded more. It demanded a life, right? Our sin demanded a death. Treated as something that you would discard, he allowed himself to carry not a pack, but our cross. He carried our cross. Then he carried the weight of our sin to the grave where it was left there when he beat death. And when the sobering effect of everything Jesus has done for you begins to take root in your life and in your heart, the following verse that I'm about to read for you changes how you see the people in the world around you. Romans 8:31 through 32. What should we say in response to these things? What Jesus has done. If God's for us, I'm free. Who can be against me? He who didn't spare his own son but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? If God is for me, I'm free to turn the other cheek because it doesn't define me. I'm free to do the things that Jesus would do. I like how theologian Dallas Willard says it. He says it this way: we live in a God-bathed world. We need to start acting like it. We live in a God-bathed world. Once you come to believe that, this is what he says: the only conclusion that you can draw is that this world, listen, this world is a safe place in which to live the way that Jesus is describing here. Because he has overcome the world. He who is in me has overcome the world. I am set free. If this is a God with you world, what do you have to prove? I don't have to be afraid. I don't have to defend myself. If this is a God with us world, I don't have to hit the person who hit me. I don't have to. I don't have to worry about giving my shirt as well as my coat. You might have to worry if I give my shirt and my coat. Nobody wants to see that. But I don't have to worry about those things. In fact, I'm so set free that maybe I can actually love the person who means to harm me. The question becomes, will I see this world the way that Jesus sees it? He saw a world in which his Father was in complete control. Complete control. Justice was guaranteed. Goodness was breaking forth. Life itself without end. The question is not whether or not we resist evil. Of course we do, right? Of course we do. We're called to be agents of righteousness and agents of justice in this world. The question is, how does that look? And I think one of the things that my heart has been challenged with is it doesn't always look like it looks in a movie that makes you feel good. Sometimes these things don't feel good. How do we pursue that righteousness? How do we pursue that justice? Jesus is essentially telling us that if you pursue it, you do it not out of anger and hatred and spite. I don't want you thinking, and listen closely, I don't want you thinking, I believe that you have to take a hit and that's that. That's not what I mean. That's not what Jesus is even after. Jesus is saying that our response comes from a completely different set of values that are not of this world. 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. found himself in charge of the civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama, during the bus boycott. And in the middle of the night, 1956, he woke up, his phone rang, and the person on the other end of the line said, if your family is not gone in 3 days, we're going to burn your house down, and they're going to die, and you're going to die. And so I don't know about you, wake up in the middle of the night, answer a phone call like that. You don't just roll over and go nighty-night. So he got up, made himself a cup of coffee, sat in the kitchen, and poured out his fears to God. He wrote that he was afraid. He was afraid for his family. He was afraid for his own life. He was afraid that what he was trying to do was useless. So he poured out his fears. He poured out his concerns to God. And then he said, in the midst of all of that, he heard a voice, not an audible voice, but it was just this voice that just kept welling up. And it kept saying, and this is what he said, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world. Okay, the voice promised to never, this is what he said, never, never leave me. Never leave me alone. Never, never, never. He promised what he would never, never leave me alone. That's what he heard that night. And from that moment on, you get the sense that he saw things differently. He endured things that nobody should endure. He saw things that nobody should see. He faced threats that nobody should face, but yet saw things through to completion in this amazing, free way. You get a sense that Martin Luther King Jr. is like the freest American on the planet at that moment because of how he conducted himself. 4 days after that phone call, it was all put to the test. 4 days. He was speaking at an event. There was a young man that ran into the event and shouted, hey, your house is on fire. Somebody firebombed your house. So the meeting ended. Martin Luther King ran home. And his family was safe. They had escaped the house, but his house was still in smoking. He'd been firebombed. But what he also encountered was this mob of angry black men with bats and guns and other weapons, ready to exact vengeance on those that did this to Martin Luther King. And in that moment, I want to tell you, my highest temptation would be to say, let me get my bat. We're going to end this fight once and for all. How many of you think that would have worked? It's amazing at the capacity of man to fight. This is what he said. He stood up in front of all of these individuals, and these are his words. I want you to love your enemies. Be good to them. This is a man whose house is burning behind him, whose family almost died at the hands of other people. Be good to them. Love them and let them know that you love them. What we are doing is right. What we are doing is just, and God is with us. Go home with this glowing faith, with this radiant assurance, with love in our hearts, with faith and with God in front. We can't lose. So this angry mob spontaneously broke into amazing grace. And they hugged each other and they went home. Martin Luther King's example helps me a lot. Because sometimes, more times than I want to admit, I still have fear and anxiety, and I feel the longing for treating even an eye for an eye, because that just sounds right. It just sounds fair. If you feel the same way, here's what I don't want. I don't want you leaving here feeling guilty today. Like I even prayed earlier. Some of you have experienced injustices and pain and suffering, the likes of which I can't even wrap my brain around. So we're all carrying something. I don't want you to feel guilty today because you struggle with this, because I do too. I do too. If you feel the same, don't leave here feeling guilty today. I want to invite you to do what I need to do, which is follow Martin Luther King's model. And just confess that frustration, confess that fear, confess that anger to God. Confess that anger to God, and then stand firm and understand that other people's actions don't define who you are. Other people's abuses don't define who you are. Who you are has been defined by a reigning king, and this is his world that we're invited to live in. But it's this upside down, and I wish I knew ways to make this feel better. I just don't. I think that though we're free, I do. I think that we're free to do what's right. I think we're free to love where love should be dismissed in the world's eyes. I think we're free to do those things. Confess your fears, confess your hurt, reveal it, and then stand firm in your freedom as a citizen of a different kingdom. Of a different kingdom. We're going to receive communion at this time. I'm going to ask you, if you would, to take that cup. Every once in a while when we receive communion, I think it's good to be reminded of the men that Jesus was sitting with at that table. The most obvious two that we know would fail him are Judas. Judas was about to betray him, sell him for 30 pieces of silver to the Roman guard and the religious elite, where Jesus would then be carted away, arrested, abused, mistreated, beaten savagely, and die. He would die. That was at the hands of one of his greatest followers. Another one, obviously, is Peter. Peter would even deny knowing who he was to a middle school girl who would say, "Hey, aren't you with him?" He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He would deny even knowing Jesus. And then, other than the disciple John, these other disciples, as Jesus is hanging on a cross, are nowhere to be seen. Betrayal, running, and yet Jesus in this meal decides, you're the people I'm breaking bread with. I will love you even so. I'm so glad that Jesus invites me to the table and loves me even so. Because God knows I betrayed him so many times. I've heard so many words that he's said and thought, boys will be boys, girls will be girls, you know. But I'm so glad that he still invites me to the table to break bread.